Some UFO sightings are much more believable than others. Even after years of scrutiny and investigative work, these paranormal incidents continue to baffle even the most dedicated researchers. But that's not supposed to happen. Logic and mainstream science is supposed to disprove the existence of UFOs. These stories are supposed to fall apart upon closer examination, and the public is supposed to breathe a sigh of relief knowing that somebody just made it all up. But in a few rare cases, these investigations have the opposite effect. Instead of proving witnesses wrong, researchers are forced to throw their hands up in the air and admit they have no idea how this could have happened. The Cash-Landrum Incident is a clear example of this. On December 29th of 1980, 3 witnesses saw UFOs in Dayton, Texas, while driving at night. But unlike many other UFO sightings, there was clear evidence that something strange happened. After 4 decades, this evidence continues to raise startling questions. What happened that night? What did these witnesses actually see? What is the government trying to hide? Let's find out.
There's 51 million people entering another
surveillance camera capturing the
unidentified flying
lockdowns and mass
I'm
testing.
right there today that the world is going to end.
There were 3 witnesses on the night of December 29th. Betty Cash, Vicki Landrum, and a 7-year-old boy named Colby Landrum, Vicki's grandson. At 9 p.m., they were all driving home after eating at a restaurant when they saw a strange light just above the tree line. At first, they assumed that it was a plane and kept driving, but a few minutes later, the light seemed to circle back, and this time it was much brighter. Clearly, this was no plane, and it was not headed to the Houston International Airport as they had initially assumed. Even more strange was the fact that it seemed to be shooting out some kind of heat wave. In fact, this heat was so intense that Betty and Vicki could feel it.
We didn't know what it was, but we knew that there was something that was lighting up the sky.
It was at this point that these 2 women began to argue. Vicki was terrified and urged Betty to stop the car, but Betty was convinced she was witnessing the manifestation of Jesus Christ and told the others, "He will not hurt us." In any case, they couldn't turn around and go back. The road was too narrow, and they risked getting stuck in the mud if they attempted a 3-point turn. Finally, they decided to simply get out of the car to try to see what was going on.
And we traveled about close to a mile, I guess, when it started to get real close.
The boy was so scared that he refused to get out. So Vicki quickly went back to comfort her grandson while Betty ventured further towards the object. As she drew nearer, she began to see more details. The UFO was vaguely diamond-shaped, and it seemed to be constructed from a dull metallic silver. Betty was able to make out a number of blue lights around its center, and she saw it expel plumes of fire toward the ground. According to Betty, the fire seemed to be keeping the aircraft afloat. These flames created incredible levels of heat, to the point where Betty and Vicki were extremely alarmed. Their car became so hot that they couldn't even open their doors without using coats to protect their hands.
She went forward, and her handprint was embedded into the dash of the car.
Betty suffered notable burns to her hands when she raced back to her vehicle in fear. Just one of the many strange injuries she experienced that night. But things were about to get much stranger. Suddenly, a group of military helicopters arrived at the scene and encircled the UFO. The UFO then attempted to evade by rising up higher into the sky. gaining altitude at a breathtaking speed.
I counted 22, and Kobe said, "There's another one," and I said, "That makes 23." And they were the kind of helicopters that you just don't see, because I didn't know what kind they were. And I knew it had to belong to the Army.
Betty watched as the UFO darted away into the night, pursued by over 20 of these aircraft.
I don't believe in the little green men. And it had to be an object. It could have been a spacecraft that the government was carrying, but our government was carrying it.
During this time, a Dayton detective named Lamar Walker and his wife also saw the Chinook helicopters flying in the same general location. However, they did not see a UFO. Other witnesses reportedly saw something strange that night as well. Some saw the helicopters, some saw the strange lights, and some saw both. From start to finish, the experience lasted just 20 minutes, but it would prove to have lasting effects for Betty, Vicky, and Colby. The most disturbing thing about this incident is that all three witnesses reported injuries that seemed to have been caused by the UFO. After arriving home that night, they experienced nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and a general feeling of weakness. Strange sunburns appeared on their skin, and they felt as though their eyes were burning. Although all three individuals experienced these injuries, Betty's symptoms were by far the worst, probably because she was the one who exited the vehicle and approached the UFO. Blisters erupted across her skin, and she was eventually taken to the emergency room at a nearby hospital.
All I wanted was water. My head was killing me. I could not get rid of the headache. I had an upset stomach. I was just sick. I mean, completely.
She spent the next 12 days getting medical treatment, completely unable to walk. By the time she was released, she had lost entire patches of skin and clumps of hair. She would eventually return to the hospital for further treatment, and she tested positive for cancer. Although Vicky escaped this fate, she did develop severe cataracts, probably due to staring at the UFO. Almost immediately, medical professionals began to suspect that the victims had suffered from some kind of radiation poisoning. All of their symptoms seemed to be consistent with exposure to some kind of radioactive material. But what was it? What kind of technology could have caused this type of injury? If it belonged to the military, then it was clearly some kind of top-secret project, and this meant that no Army officials were willing to come forward and help the victims. Doctors later noted that if they had known exactly what kind of radiation Betty had been exposed to, her injuries would have been easier to treat. What we know for sure is that it couldn't have been a typical blast of ionizing radiation, because this would have killed all three individuals within days. Instead, researchers believe that the radiation could have been infrared, and that the victims may have been exposed to radioactive aerosols. Betty's personal doctor later stated that she was suffering from the same radioactive sickness experienced by those 3 to 5 miles from the epicenter of Hiroshima. Betty eventually died at the age of 69, after fighting a long battle with cancer. So what actually happened that night? What did Vicky and Betty see? While many researchers don't rule out aliens, the general belief is that it was some kind of military experiment. Vicky Landrum herself is convinced that the UFO was not of extraterrestrial origin, and that it was instead some kind of experiment carried out by our own government. Betty also seems to believe that it was a military craft.
If it's a top secret object that's protecting the United States, then I could say I could forgive them for that.
1 year after the event, Vicky and her grandson Colby saw Chinooks fly into Texas once again. By this point, Colby had developed an intense fear of helicopters due to the earlier UFO incident. Vicky believed that if her grandson was able to see the helicopter up close, his fears would fade. As a result, she took him to a landing zone, where he was able to go inside a Chinook and speak with the pilot. Vicky joined the conversation, and they all began speaking about the UFO incident. Apparently, the pilot admitted that he was one of the people flying Chinooks in the area that fateful night, claiming that the mission was to check on a UFO. But when Landrum mentioned that she had been burned by the craft, the pilot immediately stopped talking and told her to leave. All of this alleged evidence suggests that the craft was in fact a human creation. Eventually, both Becky and Vicky decided to file a lawsuit against the US federal government, seeking $20 million in damages. At first, it seemed as though this lawsuit might shed light on the UFOs and the military's involvement in experimental aircraft. Testimony was provided by several notable officials, including those connected with NASA and the Air Force. However, a judge dismissed the case in 1986, pointing out that the US military did not have possession of an aircraft matching Betty's description. Both women were extremely disappointed.
To think that we had a federal judge that would not even give us a chance to speak up or to be heard.
One has to wonder whether this case was kept out of the public eye because the government was afraid of what might be revealed. Of course, the military didn't admit they had possession of a UFO. That's the whole point of a top-secret program. Somewhat predictably, many skeptics claim that this entire incident was fabricated. Some point out that the Chinooks could not have been real, as they were not linked with any branch of the military. Records show that no nearby air bases allowed any helicopters to fly that night. But what about unmarked so-called black helicopters that operate completely independent of normal military operations? What if these Chinooks were actually used by a shadowy government agency that technically doesn't even exist? Some point out that Betty and Vicky could have been suffering from health issues before the UFO sighting. But does that really make sense? Aside from some kind of experimental accident, how else would they have been exposed to radiation while driving down a rural road in Texas? In addition, it's worth pointing out that no one ever questioned either woman's mental state, and all of the investigators, including military personnel, considered them to be reliable witnesses. At the end of the day, the truth seems very straightforward. We simply have no idea what happened that night. But what does the military know? That's another question altogether.